The cell physiology. Cell membranes. Cell membranes are composed primarily of phospholipids and proteins. Lipid bilayer. Phospholipids have a glycerol backbone, which is the hydrophilic water-soluble head, and two fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic water insoluble. The hydrophobic tails face each other and can form a bilayer. Lipid soluble substances. For example, oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones cross cell membranes because they can dissolve in the hydrophobic lipid bilayer. Water soluble substances. Sodium, chlorine, glucose, water cannot dissolve in the lipid of the membrane but may cross through water filled channels or pores or may be transported by carriers. Proteins. Integral proteins are anchored to and embedded in the cell membrane through hydrophobic interactions. They span the cell membrane, include ion channels, transport proteins, receptors, and guanosine 5-triphosphate GTP binding proteins, G proteins. Peripheral proteins are not embedded in the cell membrane, are not covalently bound to membrane components, are loosely attached to the cell membrane by electrostatic interactions. Intercellular connections, tight junctions, zonula occludens, are the attachments between cells, often epithelial cells, may be an intercellular pathway for solutes depending on the size, charge, and characteristics of the tight junction, may be tight impermeable as in the renal distal tubule or leaky permeable as in the renal proximal tubule and gallbladder. Gap junctions are the attachment between cells that permit intercellular communication, for example, permit current flow and electrical coupling between myocardial cells. Transport across cell membranes. Simple diffusion. Characteristics of simple diffusion is the only form of transport that is not carrier mediated, occurs down an electrochemical gradient downhill, does not require metabolic energy, and therefore is passive. Diffusion can be measured using the following equation. J is equal to minus PA bracket C1 minus C2, where J is flux flow, P permeability, A area, C1 concentration, C2 concentration 2. Sample calculation for diffusion. The urea concentration of blood is 10 mg per 100 milliliter. The urea concentration of proximal tubular fluid is 20 mg per 100 milliliter. If the permeability to urea is 1 into 10 minus 5 centimeters by second and the surface area is 100 centimeters square, what are the magnitude and direction of the urea flux? Permeability is the P in the equation for diffusion. Describes the ease with which a solute diffuses through a membrane. Depends on the characteristics of the solute and the membrane. Factors that increase permeability: oil, water, partition coefficient of the solute increases solubility in the lipid of the membrane. Radius size of the solute increases the diffusion coefficient and speed of diffusion. Membrane thickness decreases the diffusion distance. Small hydrophobic solutes, oxygen, carbon dioxide, have the highest permeabilities in lipid membranes. Hydrophilic solutes, for example, sodium, potassium, must cross cell membranes through water-filled channels or pores or via transporters. If the solute is an ion is charged, then its flux will depend on both the concentration difference and the potential difference across the membrane. Carrier-mediated transport includes facilitated diffusion and primary and secondary active transport. The characteristics of carrier-mediated transport are stereospecificity. For example, glucose, the natural isomer, is transported by facilitated diffusion, but the L isomer is not. Simple diffusion, in contrast, would not distinguish between the two isomers because it does not involve a carrier. Saturation. The transport rate increases as the concentration of the solute increases until the carriers are saturated. The transport maximum is analogous to the maximum velocity in an enzyme kinetics. Competition structurally related solutes compete for transport sites on carrier molecules. For example, galactose is a competitive inhibitor of glucose transport in the small intestine. Facilitated diffusion. Characteristics of facilitated diffusion occurs down an electrochemical gradient downhill similar to simple diffusion, does not require metabolic energy and therefore is passive, is more rapid than simple diffusion, is carrier mediated and therefore exhibits stereospecificity, saturation and competition. Example of facilitated diffusion: glucose transport in muscle and adipose tissues is downhill, is carrier mediated and is inhibited by sugars such as galactose, therefore it is categorized as facilitated diffusion. In diabetes mellitus, glucose uptake by muscle and adipose cells is impaired because the carriers for facilitated diffusion of glucose requires insulin. Primary active transport. Characteristics of primary active transport occurs against an electrochemical gradient uphill, requires direct input of metabolic energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate and therefore is active, is carrier mediated and therefore exhibits stereospecificity, saturation and competition. Examples of primary active transport: sodium potassium ATPase, sodium potassium pump in cell membranes transport sodium from intracellular to extracellular fluid and potassium from extracellular to intracellular fluid. It maintains low intracellular sodium and high intracellular potassium. Both sodium and potassium are transported against electrochemical gradients. Energy is provided from the terminal phosphate bond of ATP. The usual stoichiometry is 3 sodium by 2 potassium. Specific inhibitors of sodium potassium ATPase are the cardiac glycoside drugs Ovibane and Digitalis. Calcium ATPase for calcium pump in the sarcoplasmic reticulum or cell membranes transports calcium against an electrochemical gradient. Sarcoplasmic and endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase is called SERCA. Hydrogen potassium ATPase for proton pump is in gastric parietal cells and renal alpha intercalated cells transports hydrogen into the lumen of the stomach or renal tubule against its electrochemical gradient. It is inhibited by proton pump inhibitors such as omeprazole. Secondary active transport. Characteristics of secondary active transport. The transport of 2 or more solutes is coupled. One of the solutes, usually sodium, is transported downhill and provides energy for the uphill transport of the other solutes. Metabolic energy is not provided directly but indirectly from the sodium gradient that is maintained across cell membranes. Thus, inhibition of sodium potassium ATPase will decrease transport of sodium out of the cell, decrease the transmembrane sodium gradient and eventually inhibit secondary active transport. If the solutes move in the same direction across the cell membrane, it is called co-transport or symport. Examples are sodium glucose co-transport in the small intestine and renal early proximal tubule and sodium potassium 2 chlorine co-transport in the renal thick ascending limb. If the solutes move in opposite directions across the cell membranes, it is called counter-transport, exchange or antiport. Examples are sodium calcium exchange and sodium hydrogen exchange. Example of sodium glucose co-transport. The carrier for sodium glucose co-transport is located in the luminal membrane of intestinal mucosal and renal proximal tubule cells. Glucose is transported uphill, sodium is transported downhill. Energy is derived from the downhill movement of sodium. The inwardly directed sodium gradient is maintained by the sodium potassium pump on the basolateral blood side membrane. Poisoning the sodium potassium pump decreases the transmembrane sodium gradient and consequently inhibits sodium glucose co-transport. Example of sodium calcium co-transport or exchange. Many cell membranes contain a sodium calcium exchanger that transports calcium uphill from low intracellular calcium to high extracellular calcium. Calcium and sodium move in opposite directions across the cell membrane. The energy is derived from the downhill movement of sodium. As with co-transport, the inwardly directed Sodium gradient is maintained by sodium potassium pump poisoning. The sodium potassium pump therefore inhibits sodium calcium exchange.